He slid the papers across the table and didn't even look up. "Sign them," he said. He was checking his phone. His lawyer was beside him. His girlfriend, the one he had stopped bothering to hide 3 months ago, was waiting outside in a car that Miriam had helped him pick out. Because she had picked out everything for 12 years, and old habits are hard to kill even when you are killing the marriage. Miriam Crane looked at the papers. Then she looked at her husband of 12 years. Daniel Crane, founder of Crane Capital, a man who had once told her on a rooftop in Barcelona that she was the reason any of it made sense to him. She reached for the pen. He grabbed her wrist before she could take it. Hard, not a bruise, not quite, but hard enough that she felt the intention of it, the old habit of controlling the pace of every transaction, every conversation, every room. He waited until she looked at him. "You understand what this means?" he said. "Without me, you're nothing. You have no career, no network, no money that isn't mine. You leave here today and you are starting from absolute zero." He said it quietly. His lawyer was watching. The paralegal in the corner was watching. He said it like he was doing her a favor by being honest. He let go of her wrist. She picked up the pen. She signed her name, her real name, Miriam Halkett. The name she had kept through 12 years of being introduced as Daniel's wife. And she set the pen down, and she stood up, and she looked at him across the conference table, and she said nothing at all. Because the thing she could have said would have taken the floor out from under him, right there, in that room, in front of his lawyer and his paralegal, and the glass walls through which his entire office could see him. And she had decided, a long time ago, that when the floor went, she wanted to be the one who chose the moment. She walked out. What you have to understand about Miriam Halkett is that she was not a woman who had been nothing before Daniel Crane. She had been a corporate restructuring analyst with a reputation sharp enough to cut. The person companies called when a collapse was coming, and they needed someone to see the whole architecture of failure in one clean look. She had been 31 years old, with a client list that most partners twice her age would have built a career on, and she had met Daniel at a conference in Milan and fallen in love with a man who seemed to find the way she thought about systems and leverage and long games not threatening but thrilling. For the first 4 years, she thought she had been right about him. What Daniel had actually wanted was not a partner. He had wanted a particular kind of mirror, one that showed him back at his most capable, most visionary, most certain. And Miriam, because she loved him, and because she was generous in ways that cost her things she didn't account for, had provided that mirror faithfully. She had quieted her instincts in board meetings to let him take the floor. She had declined assignments that would have taken her out of reach. She had introduced herself at 300 events over 12 years as Daniel's wife, not because she had been asked to, but because she had understood, gradually and without anyone saying it, that her presence in a room was inversely related to his comfort. She made herself smaller so he could feel larger. The first crack she saw in him came 6 years in. They were at a dinner with 2 of his board members, and one of them, a woman named Petra, had said she had read the Halkett analysis on the Meridian restructuring and thought it was some of the clearest thinking on leverage cycles she had seen in a decade. Daniel went very still. In the car home, he said, "You don't need to talk about your old work in front of my board." Petra brought it up. "It makes people uncomfortable," he said. "Like you're reminding them of something." She looked at him. Reminding them of what? He didn't answer. He turned on the radio. And Miriam looked out the window and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that the thing she was being asked not to remind people of was herself. That was 6 years in. She stayed 6 more. That is not weakness. That is the gravity of a life built inside someone else's orbit. Leaving requires first believing the world outside still has room for you. She had to rebuild that belief from scratch, in the silences between the moments he reminded her she had none. The affair she found out about on a Tuesday in November. His phone on the kitchen counter. A message that wasn't hidden because he had stopped considering it necessary. She read it once, set the phone down, finished her coffee, and called her sister. "How long?" her sister asked. "The timestamps go back 14 months, Miriam said. Then she called Sylvie Marsh. Sylvie ran a private equity advisory firm and had spent 8 of the last 12 years trying to recruit Miriam back into the field. "I need to come back," Miriam said. "Not recruited." "Partnered. How much capital can you bring?" Sylvie asked. "I don't have capital. I have something better. I know exactly which companies are about to be worth nothing, and I know exactly why, and I have a specific interest in starting with one." "When can you come in?" Sylvie said. "If you have ever been told that you are nothing, that you are a function of someone else's generosity, that you would dissolve without their infrastructure holding you together, then I need you to stay with me right now, because what Miriam did next is the reason this story exists. And if you know someone sitting in that silence tonight, please share this with them before you keep watching." The company Daniel had built, Crane Capital, was, structurally, a 30-story building with a cracked foundation. Miriam knew this because she had read every financial document that passed through their home for 12 years. The documents came home in his bag, and the numbers were simply there for a person who understood numbers to read. She had understood them quietly for 12 years. What she had understood, for the last 3, was that Crane Capital was overexposed on 4 commercial real estate positions in markets softening in ways Daniel's team had failed to model because he had stopped listening to people who told him things he didn't want to hear. The loan covenants on 2 of those positions were going to trip in 11 months. When they tripped, the capital call would be ugly. When the call was ugly, the institutional investors would ask questions. What they found would not reassure them. Miriam had watched this unfold in slow motion for 3 years. She had tried once to say something. He had told her she didn't understand how the current market worked and she should stay in her lane. She stayed in her lane. She used the time to prepare. Sylvie's firm made the first move 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. A quiet approach to the lead institutional investor in Crane Capital, a pension fund whose trustees were already, quietly, concerned. The trustees asked for a full independent review. Daniel received the notification on a Wednesday. His lawyer called the pension fund's counsel. The counsel sent over the name of the firm that had flagged the issue. Marsh Halcott Advisory. He stared at that name for a long time. Halcott, he called Miriam's cell phone. She didn't pick up. He called again. She didn't pick up. He left a voicemail that started professional and ended somewhere else entirely, somewhere louder and less controlled, and she listened to it once and saved it because her own lawyer had told her to keep records, and she was, at her core, an analyst. She kept records of everything. The independent review took 8 weeks. It was thorough, and it was not kind to Crane Capital's modeled projections. 3 of the 4 institutional investors issued formal notices of concern. The 4th, a sovereign wealth vehicle that had come in 18 months earlier on Daniel's most recent fund, sent a separate letter requesting an emergency governance meeting. That meeting was a Thursday in March. 40 people in a room on the 42nd floor downtown. Daniel sat at the head of the table. His girlfriend was not there. She was not a professional in any position that would have put her there, which was itself a kind of statement. Miriam walked in with Sylvie at 9:03 a.m. She had not seen Daniel since the conference room. That had been 8 months ago. He looked at her the way people look at things they thought they had safely put away and have just found sitting on the kitchen table. She was wearing a charcoal suit she had bought the week after the divorce was filed. She had bought it in the color of every boardroom she had ever walked into and made herself smaller in because she had decided that the color was hers and she was taking it back. She sat down across from him. She opened her portfolio. He said, low enough that only she could hear, "What is this?" "This," she said, "is your governance meeting. You set this up." Marsh Halcott flagged the risk. The investors called the meeting. "Those are two different things." "Miriam, we're starting," she said. And she looked up at the room, 40 people, institutional capital, trustees, council, and she began. She walked them through the leverage exposure. She did not editorialize. She did not perform. She laid out the architecture of failure the way she had always laid out architectures, completely, with the specific numbers attached to each failure point and the timeline on which each would arrive. It was the clearest presentation anyone in that room had ever seen on a distressed asset situation. And two of the people around the table had worked in restructuring long enough to know exactly who Miriam Halcott had been before she became Daniel's wife. They had the expression of people watching something return to its correct position after a long displacement. Daniel said nothing for the first 30 minutes. His face went through colors. At the 40-minute mark, when the slide came up showing the precise structure of the covenant trip and the capital call exposure, and the timeline, 11 months, except that it was now 3 months because 2 of the positions had moved faster than projected, he said, loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "This analysis is not complete." The room went quiet. Miriam looked at him. "Page 31, she said. "The hedging positions you closed in August. They're on page 31. He didn't have page 31. His team hadn't seen page 31. No one on his side of the table had page 31. Because page 31 contained information from a data source that Miriam had paid for independently, and that his team had not bothered to look for, because his team, for 3 years, had been telling him what he wanted to hear. He took the copy someone slid toward him. He looked at it. The room watched him read it. His lawyer leaned over and said something in his ear. He shook his head. His lawyer said it again. He closed his eyes. Across the table, Sylvie passed Miriam a note. It said, in Sylvie's clean handwriting, "They're going to ask for the buyout proposal." They did. 12 minutes later, the lead trustee, a woman named Hannah, who had said nothing in the meeting until this moment, said, "Marsh Halcott, I understand you've come with a proposal." "We have," Miriam said. The proposal was a structured acquisition of Crane Capital's management entity. The brand, the infrastructure, the staff, the name, everything Daniel had built and put his name on, purchased at a price that reflected the actual value of the underlying positions, not the value Daniel had told the market to assign them. Fair, not flattering. The price of something mismanaged for 3 years by a man who had stopped listening. Daniel stood up. He was trying to hold himself together, and the effort was visible to everyone in the room. His jaw set the way of a man who has spent his entire professional life setting the terms, now discovering what it feels like to have terms set for him. "This is not happening," he said. His voice was not steady. "You cannot walk into this room and Daniel," her voice was quiet. The contrast between his volume and hers was itself a kind of answer. "The trustees have the authority. You signed the governance structure that allows this. You set this up. You left," she said. "I just kept working." He looked at her. Something broke open on his face in front of 40 witnesses. 12 years collapsing into this room. One moment. Miriam, his voice cracked. You can't take this. This is everything I have. She looked at him for a moment. Just a moment. You told me I was nothing without you, she said. I wanted you to see what nothing looks like. She closed her portfolio. Daniel Crane sat back down in his chair in front of 40 people and put his face in his hands. His lawyer reached over and touched his arm, and he didn't respond. The pension fund's trustee looked at the sovereign wealth representative, who looked at the independent counsel, who looked at Sylvie, who looked at Miriam. And then they moved to the vote, and it went the way it was always going to go from the moment the covenant numbers landed on page 31. In the elevator afterward, Sylvie said nothing for 6 floors. Then, he said you were nothing. He did, in a room full of witnesses. He did. How long did you know about the covenant exposure? 3 years, Miriam said. You waited 3 years. I needed the positions to deteriorate far enough that the offer would be decisive, and I needed to be outside the marriage so there was no legal question about the structure. You are, Sylvie said, the scariest person I have ever done business with. Miriam almost smiled. Thank you. Somewhere above them, Daniel's girlfriend, who had texted him 6 times during the meeting and received nothing, sent one final message at 12:47 p.m. I think we should talk. He didn't respond. She understood something in that silence and did not send another one. The acquisition closed in 60 days. The masthead changed. Miriam Halcott, managing director. Sylvie Marsh, chair, within 18 months. 3 institutional investors who had been planning their exit committed additional capital. Within 2 years, the fund had returned to metrics it hadn't hit in 7 years. Daniel spent 6 months trying to raise capital for a new vehicle. He found it harder than he expected. What traveled in the circles that mattered was not the version he told, but the version 40 people in that room had seen. A man who called his ex-wife nothing. Watched her present the most rigorous distressed asset analysis most of them had ever witnessed, and then wept in his chair while she closed her portfolio and walked out. 2 years after the acquisition, Miriam stood in an office on the 38th floor of the same building where Daniel had once had his name on a plaque by the elevator, and felt the particular satisfaction of a woman who has spent 12 years making herself smaller and has finally, completely, stopped. Beside her desk, a framed copy of the governance meeting agenda. Her name, Miriam Halcott, on the presenter line. On her hand, a ring she had said yes to in a restaurant where the man across from her, a quiet restructuring attorney named Owen, who had worked opposing counsel on a deal 2 years ago and asked her to dinner the week after it closed, had said, I have been watching you work for 18 months. And I think you are the most formidable person in any room you enter. And I would very much like to spend my life in those rooms with you. You should know, she said. I'm not easy to be in a room with. I know, he said. That's the part I'm looking forward to. Their son was born the following spring, a new name, beginning clean. Miriam held him in morning light and felt something that was not triumph. Triumph is too loud, too pointed, but something quieter and more complete. The feeling of a person who has come back to themselves and found the way back permanent. Some people will tell you that starting over at 40 is too late. That the years you spent inside someone else's story are years you cannot reclaim. That the woman who walked out of that conference room with nothing is not the same woman who walked back in. They are wrong. She walked back in with everything she had been all along. She had simply been waiting for the room where she was finally allowed to use it. She used it. And the room understood exactly what it had in front of it. If this story reached you tonight, share it with the person who needs to hear it. And subscribe so you never miss what comes next.